A bet made about staying in a haunted house leads to a grisly discovery about a murder. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today is Short Story Tuesday, so I want to talk about an interesting short story that I read lately. Today's short story is all about Ghost. I am referring to The Ghost of Mohammed by Clark Ashton Smith, which was published in 1910 in the collection, in the literary sort of publication Overland Monthly. For those who don't know, Clark Ashton Smith was a writer who lived throughout the early the 1800s and the mid 1900s. He was primarily known for writing short stories and poetry, and his short stories were about horror and science fiction and those types of things. He traveled in the same circles that H.P. Lovecraft traveled in, which is pretty fascinating. H.P. Lovecraft even said great things about Clark Ashton Smith's writing, which is pretty cool. And he was also praised by Ray Bradbury. Pretty high praise coming from really established writers. It's really interesting. I hadn't heard of Clark Ashton Smith before then, but apparently he's a big name, being one of those writers who basically contributed to the horror genre, the science fiction, the fantasy genre of the early to mid 1900s, and stuff that's probably influenced us to this day. I know this particular short story, it might have existed. The idea of it might have existed before, but it's since I'm pretty sure you could trace a huge sort of area of contribution or influence from this short story to other short stories that were written later. So definitely something worth considering as we talk about this writer. But without further ado, let's talk about The Ghost of Mohammed. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Ghost of Mohammed focuses on an unnamed narrator. They are seemingly a British gentleman living in India. It's very colonialist. But they are talking with their friend Nicholson, and Nicholson points out a house nearby, an apartment of some sort, that is haunted in Hyderabad, I believe it is the city's name. The narrator is skeptical, but the Nicholson tells him that the man who lived there was named Mohammed Den, and he was found by his family to have been stabbed. Nobody ever found out who killed him, but everyone who has stayed or rented this apartment since then has left early because it seems that the place is haunted, and the narrator doesn't believe in the supernatural, and so they agree to make a bet with their friend Nicholson to, if they stay the night in this place, they will they'll get some money out of it. And they also tell the landlord, I'm bringing my gun with me, so if I see any ghosts, I'm going to shoot at them. And he believes that'll deter the landlord from making a ruckus to make it seem like there's a ghost there. To which the narrator just believes that that'll kind of prevent any actual ghost sighting, because it's probably the landlord's fault. As the narrator stays in this apartment overnight, they discover that it is very quiet at first. They're pretty sure that there's no ghost at all, but then things get unusually noisy. There's footsteps, the doors and windows are creaking very loudly, and the rats are scurrying about the place very loudly. The narrator's just wondering what's going on there, and then all of that seems to cease, and the narrator hears footsteps, which they think is actually coming from the apartment next door. The the narrator isn't really sure that there's anything happening here. But at this point, they then see a ghostly visage in the bedroom where they're trying to sleep. And the narrator responds by shooting once and shooting some more, and nothing seems to happen to this ghostly visage. The narrator at this point is pretty sure that the ghost is real, and they think it's Mohammed. And at this point, they see like an emerald ring on the ghost finger, and it's sort of beckoning them to another room in the apartment. And so the narrator follows, and they are sort of led to a box. The narrator can't get the box open, so he's like, I'll go back to sleep and I'll deal with this in the morning. And they're able to sleep remarkably well, despite the fact that they apparently saw a ghost, which they know is kind of strange themselves. But then the next day, Nicholson shows up and they go through the box. They find a bunch of letters that indicate that Mohammed had found out that his cousin was part of a gang that was counterfeiting. And so Mohammed told his cousin that he was going to turn him in. But then Mohammed wrote a short while later that he thought he saw his cousin in the city, and he was worried that he was going to be killed. There's no direct evidence that actually happened, but they do discover an emerald ring in the box, which confirms that, in fact, Mohammed was probably killed. And as the story comes to a close, the narrator just notes that they have the narrator's cousin and some of the other people associated with the narrator, or the cousin, arrested as well. And it seems like Mohammed is going to get some justice there, and that's where the story ends. In terms of analysis, there's not a lot to really talk about with this story. This doesn't seem to be particularly complex. It's just a ghost story, one that maybe you might have heard some variation of this particular ghost story before, because it does seem like this might have come from an existing ghost story, or a lot of people might have stolen from this and just told this type of story around a campfire. The main idea of this story seems to be unfinished business. It's a classic horror archetype. A ghost shows up, and the narrator, the protagonist, is supposed to help the ghost with something, figure out its unfinished business, and then the ghost can be free. The ghost can sort of move on into the next life. The ghost needs help before it can move on, essentially. And in this case, the ghost was murdered. Mohammed then was murdered, and his ghost, wants justice, essentially. And so the ghost leads the narrator to the box, finds the evidence, and then Muhammad's cousin is arrested, and the justice has been found, and presumably at this point the ghost is at peace. That's the traditional story that takes place in this sort of horror archetype here. But another interesting thing is that those who listen to the ghost are often rewarded, because in some variation of this story, you see the ghost also lead a person to their treasure, lead a person to their hoard of something that they had at one point, a sort of transaction of some kind. In this case, the narrator I think they'll probably be able to keep the emerald in this story. It's a very valuable emerald, and they are rewarded for helping the ghost find justice. This is something I've heard a lot, and this sort of kind of a trope, I would say, this narrative piece. Again, I don't know if this is actually where the source is of this kind of this kind of supernatural story, or if it existed before. I certainly haven't heard of anything coming before this, but I have heard of a lot afterwards, which is why I think this is hugely influential. Many other types of stories of people trying to help ghosts find justice of some kind. A good example that I can think of, just in media and whatnot, is What Lies Beneath. A movie with Harrison Ford and Michelle Pfeiffer. They move into a house, and that house begins to become haunted in a way that only Michelle Pfeiffer's character can see. As she learns more about the ghost, she finds out that this ghost was a woman who was married to Harrison Ford's character previously, and it turns out that he murdered this woman, and she helps that ghost get justice out of the entire thing. So, although I wouldn't say she's necessarily rewarded by having her husband get killed, but it's the general idea of you're no longer married to a murderer or something like that, and that's something similar, and that's sort of what you see in this type of story. It's not the exact format, but it does share a lot of the similar themes, and maybe that's something that's existed for a while, of helping the unjustly murdered, helping those who suffered find peace in some way, but that's a large part of this story overall. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Ghost of Mohammed Den by Clark Ashton Smith. It's an okay short story. Again, not particularly complex. Maybe the most interesting thing about it is its sort of influence on other stories down the road, perhaps. Clark Ashton Smith probably has a huge influence in that regard, and he's a particularly interesting writer, although again, this isn't particularly that deep. You might want to find a different horror short story if you're interested in something maybe more substantial, something more juicy, I would say, because this seems very bare bones at times, but it is still interesting, and I'll put a link to it in the description. If you have any thoughts on it, let me know. If you want to say something about my review here, let me know as well. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this short story or this author if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and ghostly travels. Farewell.